Several weeks ago, Nikon gave me their Z 400mm f4.5, and they mainly gave it to me so that I could get a bit used to the Nikon Z9, get into the Nikon system before I then received the 600mm f4 for review. And I was initially not really interested in the 400mm f4.5 per se, just because with 400mm, for me as a wildlife photographer, it's rather short sight. And if I would buy a 400mm lens, I thought it would for sure be a 400mm 2.8, just because of the nicer background blur. However, when I first tried the 400mm f4.5, I was really blown away. It's hard to describe, but I had so much fun with the lens because it's so lightweight, so versatile. So in the end, I ended up using it way more. So I was still using it when I already had the 600mm f4. And now that I already gave the 600mm f4 back to Nikon, I'm still having this lens and shooting with it and enjoying it a lot. And in this video, I want to share with you my experiences with the lens. I want to show some sample pictures, talk about the image quality, autofocus, also how good you can combine it with an external converter, and so on. So let's talk about the lens design and handling. The 400mm f4.5 is kind of unique because if you look at Sony or Canon, there is not really an equivalent. So it puts it in a really unique and special position. And the first thing you will notice when you lift it, it's very light. It weighs around 1.25 kilograms. So that's lighter than, for example, an RF 100 to 500, or also lighter than a Nikon Z 100 to 400. So having this kind of Supertele with this weight is really amazing. And it's also quite short. I mean, without the lens hood, we're at around a bit less actually than 24 centimeters. If you compare it again to the 100 to 500, it's a bit longer than the 100 to 500, but not by much. So it easily fits in a small backpack, or if you have a bigger backpack where you have a big lens like the Z 600mm f4, this one easily fits on the side as a second lens, and I really appreciated that. The minimum focal distance is around 2.5 meters, so there it falls short compared to a Nikon Z 100 to 400mm. It's still a nice value, I think, if you want to take portraits of some ducks, swans, and so on. And for any other bird photography, I think it's really enough. However, if you want to also use it as a pseudo macro lens, I would say, for dragonflies and so on, I think here you will reach a bit the limit because the maximum magnification that you can get is 1:6. Of course, you can optimize this a bit if you put an extender, but that's maybe one small weakness of this lens. I assume this is due to the lens design. I'm not the biggest fan of tripods in wildlife photography, and especially when I have a lens that is as light as this one, I never use a tripod. So what I found quite cool here is that the lens foot, you can easily detach it. You just loosen this screw, push this button, and it just glides out. I have it here. If I need it again, I can easily put it in. It's kind of a different solution than what Canon, for example, is doing. For the 100 to 500, you can see I just removed the whole lens collar. I'm not sure which system is better, just it's a different approach, and I also like this approach a lot. Let's move to what things this lens has in terms of switches and buttons. So here's the LFN function. I didn't really use this just because for me the position is not so good. I'm usually having it here. So that being said, I mostly use these LFN2 buttons here. There is 4, so that no matter how you turn the lens, you always can reach one easily, and they came in really handy. So what I put here was to recall a specific focus distance. And this focus distance you can set with this button here, the memory set. And this button here is so nicely positioned, so if I shoot with the camera, I can just easily get it with my middle or with the ring finger. And the combination of these two buttons worked really amazing to just quickly set a focus and then jump to this one. This was really handy when using the lens. Apart from that, we have here an AF/MF switch, and below we have a focal limiter for 6 meters to infinity, or the full range. We don't have a closer distance, unfortunately. And everything else, like the IS on/off or the different modes of the IS, you will need to set in the camera body in the menu system, not on the lens. There's 2 more things on this lens. There is like this function ring here. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the implementation of Nikon's function ring if I want to put an ISO or an aperture, something with discrete values on it, because it just goes continuously and smoothly. So for me, it's a bit hard to feel compared to the 100 to 500, which has like small steps. Maybe you can even hear this. And this gives me a much better feedback. Behind there is the manual focus ring, and this is maybe my biggest complaint about the whole lens. It's not a deal breaker, but I would have wished that this would be a bit more in front of the lens, just because if I handle the lens, usually my hand is a bit more in front. So I would have preferred if they switch the function and the focus ring, or just move the focus ring a bit in front and the function ring up here, because here is just something that has, yeah, no function. It's not turnable, it's just some rubber. I would have preferred to push everything a bit more to the front. So let's talk about the image quality of the Nikkor Z 400mm f4.5. Overall, I was very impressed. I got a lot of sharp images, the color rendition was nice, I had no problems with chromatic aberrations and so on. And also when shooting backlit, I was very pleased also with these flares that I got due to some water droplets that were out of focus. And the shape of the flares and everything was fine. Of course, they were not as big as they would be with a 600mm f4. This is just physics, but the look was overall very pleasant. And I was also trying to take some pictures with the 1.4 tele extender from Nikon. And I need to say, also with this one, the lens performs really well. Not only the image quality that is still excellent, but also the autofocus performance and the whole handling didn't take a significant drop or anything. And I also tried to take one or two kind of studio samples of the sharpness, once in the center of the frame and once at the edge of the frame. And as you can see, it's tack sharp in the middle, and also at the edge of the frame it's still very sharp. And if I put the 1.4 tele extender, the image looks quite similar. We lose a bit more sharpness maybe at the edge, but it's still a very good image quality. And also, to be fair, usually I don't place my subjects that much in the edge. Usually they're a bit more between center and edge. So in real world, I would not worry at all about image quality, no matter where you put your subject. And also if you shoot wide open, I just did this test wide open, because I think if you buy a lens like this for wildlife photography, you often don't want to close it down too much just to gain more sharpness. And to illustrate this a bit better, I just wanted to show you now a few sample pictures that I took over the last few weeks. The best theoretical image quality is not really useful if the autofocus of the lens cannot keep up. And I had some lenses in the past, not from Nikon, I had some lenses in the past that had like a problem of a pumping autofocus, or an autofocus that was not quick enough, or had somehow problem communicating with the camera, and none of it is true for this lens. The autofocus performance was really good. It was quick. Once it was tracking the bird, it really stayed on. There was no problem whatsoever. In direct comparison to the 600mm f4 with the integrated tele converter from Nikon, I had the feeling the 600mm was a bit better in overall autofocus performance, but this was still very good, and the autofocus is very quiet. And I think it's just a great lens for like birds in flights and action photography. Not only because of the autofocus, but also because it's such a light lens, because it's a bit shorter than the 600mm. So this also helps to like keep the subject in the frame if you have a bird that moves quickly or flies kind of erratically. And I remember that a bit back in the days, Canon had the 400mm f5.6 without image stabilizer or anything, and that was quite a popular lens for bird in flight. And I think for Nikon, this kind of is already a step more, because you have aperture 4.5 instead of 5.6, so nicer background rendition. And additionally, it's kind of a modern lens. You have IS if you need it, it's super lightweight and so on. So I think especially for action photography, this is an amazing one. So for birds in flight, this lens is really fun, but I don't only do birds in flight or action photography in general. Sometimes I also like to work with longer shutter speed because it gets a bit darker and maybe the animal is not moving so quickly. And as I mentioned, I don't like to use tripods. So this means I kind of rely on the image stabilizer. And I immediately noticed that the image stabilizer of this lens is very pleasant. Like if you look through the viewfinder and just half press the shutter button, you see how the image gets really smooth. This also helps if you film. But what about photography? So here I want to give you a bit more concrete numbers. Just please don't go out and compare them to other lenses that were reviewed from other photographers, or maybe not even other lenses that I reviewed in the past. Because for me, how steady you are, it doesn't only depend on the image stabilizer, it also depends on the photographer and also on the daily form of the photographer. If I had 3 cups of coffee, my images will be a bit more shaky. However, I think we can do a good comparison to the 100 to 500 because I shot them both just after each other. I was switching back and forth, so I think this should be a quite fair comparison. And of course, we can just see the difference of having the image stabilizer enabled on the Nikon and having it disabled. So I started with 1/25th of a second. This is like the lowest I usually go, but also sometimes if you have a weird position, you might have a similar level of stability even with a 1/80th or 100th of a second, just because you're not stable anymore, which I would try to avoid, but you know when you want to get a really nice angle, sometimes it's not possible. So let's go with 1/25th of a second. First we go with the Nikkor Z 400mm f4.5 with image stabilizer deactivated. And here all my images were blurry. So you can see maybe I don't have the steadiest hand, but on the other hand 400mm, 1/25th of a second. Not so surprising that we don't get many sharp images here. So then I turned the image stabilizer on and only 5% of the images were blurry. 12% were what I would consider like usable but not tag sharp, and then the 83% were really tag sharp, where I was really happy with the performance. I did the same with the 100 to 500 from Canon, just to have a comparison with a lens that I know very well. And here we had 2% of the images really blurry, 17% acceptable and 81% really tag sharp. So you can see they're at a very, very similar level. If I would repeat the test for more times, maybe it would just flip around. I think they're really comparable and both show really excellent image stabilization. So Nikon, job well done here. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is not really the lens I would typically buy. Usually I prefer a bit more focal length, like a 600mm f4. And if I would go for a 400mm, I would go for the 2.8, just because of the background blur that you can get. So I was a bit concerned if the background could still be like nicely blurry with this lens or not. And maybe you have already seen it in the sample pictures before. Usually it's no problem. I was surprised how easy it was to still get a nice out-of-focus background. Yes, a 600mm f4 makes the job a lot easier, you need to think a bit less. With this you might need to move the position a bit more, maybe once or twice go a bit closer or shoot with different light, but it is possible. And I think a really important aspect is here that you know how to use the lens, how it works with out-of-focus background. If you're interested in this and more tips about bird photography, I just released my new ebook, The Guide for Better Bird Photos. I will link it down in the description. So what's my conclusions about this lens and who would I recommend getting one? First of all, it's really an awesome lens. The weight is so nice, it handles amazingly, autofocus is good, image stabilizer is amazing, the image quality is good, I like the look of the picture. So yes, I really liked it, and I think if you're kind of a beginner photographer, you want to get a bit more advanced, go to the next level, but you don't want to get a 400mm 2.8 or a 600mm f4, I think this could be your lens, especially if you have subjects that are usually not too far away, like that you can more or less do with 400mm or maybe with the 1.4 extender. I think it's a perfect choice. If you already have a 600mm f4, I'm not 100% sure if I would get this one or maybe rather the 100 to 400mm lens, which is a tiny bit heavier, also a tiny bit more expensive. The background rendering is not as nice anymore, but you have this flexibility of a zoom. I think here it depends a bit what you prefer. Just in general, I'm super happy that Nikon is like innovating and bringing this new light Supertele lenses that are kind of affordable. They have all the professional stuff like weather sealing, all these function buttons and so on. I wish Canon and Sony would do something similar. Finally, one complaint that I have is that there is not a good camera for this lens in my opinion. What about the Z9? Isn't it a good camera? Yes, it's a really good camera, but the Z9 is heavier than the lens. And for me, I don't know, it feels like a bit of a weird combination. I just wish that Nikon would bring soonish a Z8 or Z7 Mark III, however you want to call it, that has a lot of the technology of the Z9, but in a smaller body that is also more affordable, because also you spend much more money on the Z9 than on this 400mm f4.5. So that's it. I think I reviewed all the Nikon gear that I had to test for the last 3 weeks. Just let me know, do you want to see more Nikon videos in the future? I cannot promise anything, but then I can maybe ask for Nikon. So let me know in the comments. If you have specific wishes like this and that lens, even better, let me know, and see you in the next video.